is affirmative action not racist? I understand the idea of fixing systemic racism and fixing past wrongs. But isn't selecting candidates based on their race racism? What's the logic behind it not being racist? Edit. I'm genuinely trying to form an opinion. I live in a conservative area and don't want to just go with the echo chamber. Stop assuming I'm against it just for asking the question. Because of its purpose. Kind of like how chemo isn't just poison. It's used to fight something else. i.e., systemic racism. Suppose two kids, Steve and Dan, both took the same exam. Steve came from a wealthy family, received private one-on-one tutoring, and was able to dedicate all of his time to studying. Dan came from a poor family, got a public school education, and had to work on the weekends so his family could afford rent. If Steve got a 95 on the exam, and Dan got a 93, who would you say deserved the last spot at a prestigious university more? Anytime you use skin color to make decisions that benefit one person and harm another, that is racist. Even if you mean well by doing it, it's still racist. It is racist. It had a very good point behind it, and it helped in some things. But eventually, it became a tool to discriminate against whites and in some industries Asians. It's time for it to go. Skin color ethnicity shouldn't be a deciding factor in any educational scheme or any employment industry. People say we should have equality. What they really mean is we should have equality unless it takes special rights away from the groups getting them. In theory it could be. In practice it isn't. They're not just letting in every non-white and non-Asian applicant, and colleges use more than a students' test scores to consider acceptance. In Abigail Fisher's case against UT Austin, it was argued that less qualified students of color were admitted into UT over Fisher. It was true. 5 students with lower test scores got in. It's also noteworthy to mention the 42 white students with lower test scores that also got in over her. So why was she so accusatory towards the 5 and not the other 42? Plenty of people are talking about race as an indicator of socioeconomic struggles. It's not great at that, but also not completely useless either. However, diversity on its own can be beneficial. The US isn't a completely homogeneous culture, so having people with different backgrounds and viewpoints is a good thing. For breaking echo chambers. As an example, 350 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and now we are somehow colorblind. The fantasy court says we are. An extremely smart person from a disadvantaged community will likely have lower test scores than an extremely smart person from an advantaged community simply due to life circumstances. Both individuals are equivalent on intelligence. So weighing one test score higher than the other equals them out. At least, that's the theory. It's pretty common knowledge that public education is not a level playing field. Some schools are simply better than others. Some have way more money and resources. Some have better teachers. Schools in inner cities, for example, may not have the same resources for education than schools in white suburbs. So, because there is no level playing field in public education, how could we, logically, evaluate everyone as if they were? It makes no sense. Because of historical context. If you look at the policy in a vacuum, sure it seems racist, but we don't live in a vacuum, we live in a world with a lot of history, and if you study that history it seems to make a lot of sense that we would do things that way. I've found that a major tenet of conservative policy is that they want to pretend history doesn't exist and context doesn't matter. They just look at an issue, take it at face value, and make a judgment. That is a very uninformed way to make decisions. And it leads to bad policies that don't work in practice. Before 1964, affirmative action was exclusively for whites. I like to think of it this way. Bigotry is hating someone due to innate qualities. Ism is a member of a privileged class enacting their hate on a minority class due to the minority's innate qualities. If two people are running a race and one of them has a missing leg, the goal of giving them a prosthetic leg isn't to give them an unfair advantage. The goal is to give the disadvantaged person the tools they need to compete more evenly with the person who already has the unfair advantage. Jesus fucking Christ, no one is admitted because of their race. Just like no one is admitted because of their scores. The only people who get special privilege are legacy admissions or from wealthy donors. Those are the people who get in just because. There was a professor who said it best when someone asked him, "At what point do you think affirmative action should have been repealed?" He said, "Well, slavery was around over 400 years. So let's start with that." I'm paraphrasing. But that was essentially the conversation. Affirmative action helped fight racism against minorities. Helping historically disenfranchised people isn't racism. Just because of unequal outcomes does not mean discrimination was in the process. It is racist. But liberals will never admit that. Racism, by definition, is judging someone based on the color of their skin. Full stop. 1. There's absolutely no racism involved. If anything, I think you're trying to use the word prejudicial. 2. Next. It sounds like you understand the logic in that the intent to correct historic imbalances for all. It sounds more like you just don't agree with that logic. It's definitely racist. It's making selections based on race. That meets the definition. Some people think that because intentions are good it's not racist. But both can be true at the same time. It is racism. It's just accepted racism. In my estimation, Latinos are going to be hurt the most. Black people at least have highly prestigious HBCUs such as Hampton, Howard, Tuskegee, etc. that they can attend instead. Now they're what's called Hispanic serving institutions. But they're designated based on having high percentages of Latino students, not a history of being founded by or for Latinos. Addressing the issues of race does not equal racism. Does a doctor's saying that keloid scarring is racially related make him or her a racist? From Google. In the United States, keloids are more common in Black and Latin Americans than people with lighter skin tones. Whereas, in Asia, ethnic Chinese have the highest risk of developing keloids. Racism is about imposing a social hierarchy based on racial categories. Affirmative action undermines this kind of imposition. It's always been racist. It undermines the achievements of minorities. It's blatant discrimination towards whites. And it just feeds into animosities. Now, without legally allowed anti-white racism, when minorities get jobs or enter into careers, they'll know for a fact that they're there because they earned it. And not because they're being pandered to. I'm a minority, and the idea that I've ever been hired or gained anything in life because I was a fucking checkmark makes me blood boil. It isn't racism per se, but it arguably is discrimination, and it absolutely is tokenism.